There's a series of games called Final Fantasy, and apparently it's a really big deal, but I skipped it growing up. I was more of a Legend of Legaia kind of kid, you know? An older brother of mine did later buy Final Fantasy VIII and then 7 after finding out on the internet that these were super popular RPGs for the PlayStation, but I didn't really give them much of a chance. Years later, this helped make me a bit of an outcast whenever I'd join in PlayStation 1 discussions and say, "Oh, I didn't play Final Fantasy VII, but I did play Suikoden." This got me weird looks from other kids, and then eventually teenagers, and then adults, as time passed on and I continued being a person unfamiliar with Final Fantasy. All the cred I had was playing Tactics Advance. And, I also played Mystic Quest on Super Nintendo, but that wasn't even called Final Fantasy here. Recently, as an adult, I've been making up for my sins. So I've been making my way through the series, but in order. That being said, I'm doing the PSP releases, I'm not going back to an NES RPG. These PSP releases are the end result of an iterative process that first started with handheld remakes that never left Japan. Final Fantasies 1, 2, and 4, but not 3, were all remade for the WonderSwan color in Japan from 2000 until 2002. The third game was meant to be included, but it was cancelled without any explanation. This was a 16-bit machine, so the original sprites of Final Fantasies 1 and 2 were upgraded tremendously, and there were a lot of improvements under the surface as well. A little later in 2004 and 2005, these three games, which were Fantasies 1, 2, and 4 but not 3, were released for the Game Boy Advance. This is basically the same as the WonderSwan release, but with even more upgrades mechanically. I hope you're sensing a pattern. In 2007 for Japan and North America, and 2008 for Europe and all the other places that are lumped in with Europe, Final Fantasy 1 and 2 came to PSP. These were once again iterative improvements over the same game that was originally made for the WonderSwan. But thanks to the huge leap in hardware, these versions cleaned up a lot better and have frankly beautiful pixel art, and small bits of 3D to complete things, and the music was finally freed from the GBA's lack of dedicated sound hardware. Once again, mechanically things were also improved, and this is even more so the case with the second game, which is why I'm the only person that seems to like Final Fantasy II a lot, and find it to be a much more rewarding game than the first. Oh, and also while we're on this, the first game was remade again for 3DS in Japan, and that's just another version of the same repeated game. Anyway, Final Fantasy IV would later get a PSP release, and once again it was based on the same older version, but this would come out all the way in 2011, and there's a lot more to its specific release, since it was given the fancy subtitle, The Complete Collection. Take that, earlier releases, you weren't complete enough. The reasoning behind this is it includes 2 extra stories, one called the After Years, which tells the story after the events of the original game, and this was a late addition, coming in 2008 for Japanese mobile phones, and then again in 2009 for WiiWare, and they were both released episodically and digital only, so they were finally given a proper physical release as one single unit, and it was included here on the PSP release of Final Fantasy IV, just to make sure people bought this version of Final Fantasy IV even if they owned the previous version. But that wasn't enough. Another story was added to this Final Fantasy IV collection, and this one was made entirely for the PSP, and it wasn't a way to re-release older content, which is why it's so short. Instead of being an After Years, this is Interlude, a story set between both these titles. This does make the PSP the heftiest package. It's 3 games in one, kinda, not really, like 2 games in one. And while After Years already existed beforehand and would continue to get re-released, Interlude is stuck on the PSP. But Final Fantasy IV on PSP has competition. In fact, it launched already with said competition, because like I said, this was a 2011 release, and it had to stand up against the already released Nintendo DS remake of Final Fantasy IV. And this was a full 3D recreation, released in either 2007 or 8 based on your region. This version was handled by an entirely different team than the one that constantly re-released the same game on 3 different systems. Instead, they brought us the earlier Final Fantasy III handheld remake which was a 3D version for DS in 2006 or 7. At the time, this was a bold new modernization, though with hindsight it does look out of place next to the remakes of the other games prior and its successor Final Fantasy IV. Especially on PSP where these first 4 games are all available, the 3 is still the 3D version from DS, just touched up a little, and it looks very out of place. But this fancy polygonal release did lead into Final Fantasy IV and DS, and this turned the modernization dial up to 11. Here in FF4 on DS, we have lots of fancy camera angles, voice acting, and pre-rendered video cutscenes. It was ambitious to do this on the DS of all systems, and on the original hardware this looks gorgeous. But it does mean if this was re-released on other systems, it would look very out of date and ugly, even if it is technically smoother there like on Steam. So we have 2 very different versions of Final Fantasy IV, and presentation-wise, it's between an impressive pixel art game that doesn't push boundaries at all, but holds up better, and a DS version that swung for the fences and does a lot more to push the story and environments, but does look much more dated. It's fascinating to see this. The other 3 games were only given one visual style in the remakes, so the choice was always made for you. And it's even more extreme here on Final Fantasy IV for DS and PSP, because these are both mechanically very different games with wildly divergent difficulty levels. People argue about the exact rankings of each release of Final Fantasy IV and its difficulty. Because this game has been re-released a lot, and the difficulty is pretty inconsistent. For example, the original Japanese Super Famicom release was made much simpler in its conversion to the American Super Nintendo, partially because the JRPG genre was still a small niche in America at the time, and because this was only the 2nd installment released in that market. Going from Final Fantasy 1 to 4 is quite a leap, especially if Final Fantasy 4 is the 2nd game you've played in this entire genre. It's understandable why 1991 American audiences were given a more basic version of this game, even if it irks people nowadays. But this paved the way for the 2nd release for Japanese markets, which was Final Fantasy IV Easy Type. I'm sure you can figure out the main difference with this version. After that, Final Fantasy IV began its long life of being remade and re-released constantly. 2001 saw Americans finally get the difficult version of the game when it came to PSX, and this was Europe's first taste of the game. They went straight into the deep end, huh? And then this whole cavalcade of handheld releases started, and depending on who you ask, they're either easier than the earlier Easy Type, or harder than that but still much easier than the actual release or PlayStation release. Doesn't really matter where on the spectrum it lands, just know Final Fantasy IV on PSP is generally seen as one of the easier releases, but the Nintendo DS didn't want to settle for being an easier type than the original, so it went all out and it's seen by most people to be the hardest release of the game. And yeah, it was challenging, so much so that when it came to Steam later on, it was given its own optional easy mode, which really does cement the wild ride of Final Fantasy IV's different difficulties. In short, PSP is easy, DS is hard. The reason for this huge gulf is because the DS version, being a fully 3D version built from the ground up, was free to experiment and change basically anything it wanted to. Stats are different, combat has a lot more depth to it, certain attacks were completely reinvented here, and item prices are not your friend. Though some small elements are on your side with this cruel version. Arrows were a finite item in most releases. You'd have to keep buying more ammo for your bows, and when you used archers, this would become a nuisance, and it was just another thing to keep an eye on. If you ran out, you'd really feel it. Constant arrow upgrades made this even more of a pain, because you could stock up on one kind of arrows and it would cost you, but then a few minutes later in a dungeon you'd get an even better arrow type, making all the ones you bought useless. But because arrows are infinite on the Nintendo DS, bows are not an annoying item, they're just another weapon that's on level with everything else. But before I go any further, I just need to cover the basic beats of the story. We play as Cecil, a dark knight who feels guilty about all the slaughter and stealing of important crystals he's been doing for his king, who is also kind of his adopted father. This has understandably turned him into a whiny sad boy, and I don't blame him. The guy in charge is not only his dad and his boss, but he's also the leader of a feudal society, so yeah, I can see why he did things he's not proud of. And if it wasn't obvious, he wasn't Dark Knight material. He's called Cecil, for God's sake. After his most recent deadly errand, his conscience gets the better of him, and he starts questioning all the stuff he's been doing as of late. And obviously the King Dad doesn't like this, so he strips Cecil of his position as the leader of the elite Air Force unit, the Red Wings, and then he is sent on a simple mission with his friend Kane to deliver a ring of some kind to a nearby town. Cecil agrees and he'll commit to it tomorrow, but beforehand we need to be introduced to some other characters like his love interest Rosa, a white mage, and then we get some melodrama about their relationship because a Dark Knight and white mage can't be together. This was turned up in the DS version, with its voice acting and dramatic camera angles and obvious foreshadowing the moon will be important later. The following morning, Cecil and Kane proceed to the town, but first they have to fight a mist dragon, which on PSP is phenomenal looking, and on DS he's a chunky guy and I love him. After this, our duo clad in dark armor make their way to the town, and they accidentally destroy the town and kill its populace. Whoops! The ring that was meant to be delivered was actually a weapon, and this was all part of the king's plan. This is news to Cecil, and he obviously feels terrible, and it's made even more so when he sees a little girl crying. She is the sole survivor of this incident, and she explains the mist dragon that they killed earlier was her mother's work, and killing that killed her mum. She was just trying to protect the town the whole time and it was all for naught. Kane, who is Cecil's best friend, insists on killing the girl, since this was what the king wanted, but Cecil can't do that, he doesn't want to murder children anymore. And then Kane reveals he didn't want to actually do that. That Kane, he always was a kidder. Immediately an earthquake separates Cecil and this young girl, Rydia, from Kane, and our Dark Knight soft boy starts his redemptive arc and vows to protect this girl he accidentally made an orphan of. This is pretty heavy stuff for a 1991 game on a Nintendo console. Later games would follow suit, and I don't want to dismiss the darker games that already exist prior to this. Final Fantasy IV was by no means the first game to get this dreary, but it was still early on, especially by the standards of what was allowed to be localized and released in North America, though the localization did tone things down a lot back then. Even with less direct words, the implications were clear. For context on where things were, this was released right between Dragon Quest IV and Dragon Quest V, and that's where the genre was, at least for the Japanese mainstream. Globally, it was still far behind that. And unlike the previous Final Fantasy games, this is quite a departure. While the earlier ones certainly had story, they were more focused on class and character customization. Any character could be any build, but here, all your options are determined by your progress in the story. This is a different flavour of Final Fantasy, which would eventually prove to be very successful. This whole destroying a town scene was powerful for me on PSP, and even more so on DS. I didn't expect anything like this when I first played. Shame that some releases like the Game Boy Advance and the Pixel remaster spoil the inevitable by making sure Cecil gets a bomb ring. He's going to this big town under the king's orders to deliver a bomb ring. I'm glad some localizations buried the lead here. After this, Cecil earns the girl's trust and continues to protect her from the king's forces, since they got the memo a girl survived. And Cecil, with his growing party, travel the land to put an end to the evil plan he was actually kind of a part of. At least that means he has some inside knowledge as to what's going on while the rest of the world is oblivious. But some aren't as quick to forgive this murdering Dark Knight. We see some victims of his in a particular town despise him, and they use their magic repeatedly to punish our little kind-hearted Dark Knight. It's a valuable lesson. Sometimes, even when you change as a person and make great strides in making up for your wrong deeds, some people, especially the ones most affected by you, cannot forgive you, and sometimes you can never change it. Positive growth is important, but an apology isn't guaranteed. It's honestly pretty touching to see that from a game from this era. Anyway, a few minutes later, Cecil fills up his dark soul of light, and then everyone loves and forgives him. Oh well. I mean, I would too. Look at that hair. This is a more fitting design for someone called Cecil anyway. He was a paladin assigned Dark Knight at birth, but now he can be who he always was inside. And while I did gloss over it, the whole paladin scene is done really well in both versions, and it feels earned. The class change is significant because it changes up battles fundamentally, and it also does reinforce the initial corruption of Cecil, because he had some great moves, but they would physically hurt him to use it. It added some nice risk-reward to combat proceedings, but in terms of story, it was a fantastic way of conveying an impure form of strength that could be as volatile to its user as it was to its direct victims. And it also leads excellently into two very different combat systems we have here. Because yes, they're both menu-based RPGs of an active time battle system, it's all random encounters, and you have the choice to do physical attacks, magic attacks, guarding, or running away. And whenever you win, you get money and experience. You know, it's all fairly standard for the genre, even if the active time battle system was introduced here with the game's original Super Famicom release. But by the time of its re-releases, this wasn't anything new. First of all, it took me about half the game to wipe out and game over on PSP, but on DS it happened in my very first battle, because even basic early game fodder are happy to use status moves, including one that turns you to stone, and will be fatal if not prevented. The DS goes much harder with status afflictions and frankly just making you miserable. Some areas even have enemies that will kill your entire party before you realize what's happening, and your best hope is to run away instead of actually fighting them. But outside one version being harder and the other not, their approaches to battles are very different due to how they handle our character's specific class actions. The PSP stuck with what had worked previously all the way back from 1991, but the DS took the time to reinvent things, and I generally prefer these new variations made here. Immediately recognizable as Cecil's Dark Knight powers, on PlayStation Portable, he can use an attack that costs him health instead of MP, and this does a reliable, powerful attack to all the enemies on screen. It's great for hordes and will never get outclassed until you lose the ability to perform it later. The DS traded this in for an immediately much less useful move, and giving up the multi-enemy attack contributed to why the early game was so hard. The substitute for this is a straight downgrade, but it becomes invaluable just at different times and for a completely different utility. Now this is a move that increases Cecil's physical attack power for a bit, but every time he lands an attack, it hurts himself too. I love this. It made bosses way more intense. That extra damage across an entire battle adds up, and generally speaking, all your moves and attacks are much better here on DS, but they have to be because the enemies got buffed too, and their buffs are much more dramatic. Another dramatic change is how Rosa originally prayed to heal everyone without the cost of MP, though it never really did much anyway. Here on DS, it not only heals much more health, but also everyone's MP. The idea of healing MP might seem to go against the hardcore nature of this, but it incentivizes the use of magic without worrying, and since some battles will have you curing statuses every other turn, or trying to use the most costly healing spell, this is just a way to lessen frustration without removing the difficult strategies. Other variants to combat can be optionally added in DS, thanks to the character augmentations that you can equip to a single character. For example, you could make Cecil himself be a lightning rod for all attacks, or you can give the Bard moves to a non-Bard character. The DS combat is a complex and challenging thing to deal with, and it's truly for fans of the genre first and foremost. This should never be someone's introduction to JRPG combat. But one area this stumbles is the speed of combat. Frankly, it feels slow, or at least it does in comparison to the PSP version that I was playing at the same time. And while both versions have auto combat, for example, though it is a liability on DS, a PSP speeds it up, which makes everything feel even faster on PSP, and of course our summoner makes this even more apparent. Throughout the portions of the game when we have her, she does her thing and it results in great pixel art that is over in a few seconds, whereas on DS, we fade to black, show a close-up of the character performing the spell, cut to black, see the animation of this happening, which is very impressive, but it is cumbersome. And frankly, these are impressive scenes, but they're not something I need to keep seeing. The first time was good enough, trust me. It can be skipped with button mashing, but even this feels cumbersome and it interrupts the flow of combat with the short fades to black. Plus this version had our summoner get a unique summon called White, and it's basically here to let you draw a face on the DS. And it can be so overpowered with proper care that it breaks certain encounters. As far as I know, this is a DS exclusive. Even the other releases of this 3D version removed it. I won't ever miss White, but for the fans of you that want White, this is the single version you can play. If you ignore him, it turns Final Fantasy IV into Final Fantasy IV Super Players, which would be the name of this title if I wasn't covering two different versions. Speaking of which, the PSP understands that battles are a means to an end, and while they can and should be fun spectacles, they also happen so often that you never want to be in one for too long. It made the right decision to be as quick as it can. And this also applies to overworld movement. The PSP shows a zoomed out map, and it has characters running at lightning fast speeds, even if it does have me bang into walls and overshoot turns quite a lot. For what it's worth, both these versions have an option to set running to default, so you don't even ever have to hold in a run button. The only issue with the PSP movement is that NPCs can often get in your way, and they love blocking one tile wide pathways, so you just need to wait for them to move. The DS has the exact opposite pros and cons. Movement is more freeing, and you're never stuck waiting for someone to move, thanks to these open environments and the ability to move in more than 4 directions. But while your character does still run, everything is so zoomed in, and it feels so much bigger that you never feel fast. This is somewhat alleviated with the map on the bottom screen at all times, so you'll never get lost, but because of this and the top screen being so zoomed in, I often found myself ignoring the impressive 3D vistas and only focusing on the tiny 2D map. But at least in dungeons, it becomes a fun challenge that is worth its rewards. Okay, some preamble. In most versions of a game, you can change character names by talking to an NPC called Naming Way. He's a little rabbit that constantly shows up. However, in the DS version that has voice acting, they can't rename characters, so he was repurposed to be a guy that gives you items if you explore 100% of any dungeon's floor. And given the DS version's stricter economy, this is a huge bonus. And more so, it found a way to incentivize exploration. Without it, exploration would be an optional way to play, and it could result in great finds, but more often than not felt like a waste of time. Now no time is wasted, because even if it isn't a treasure for you, you're still getting something. Though the speed of the game does slow down, when the game has to slowly congratulate you on uncovering everything. But much like the combat and movement, this is another area where the ambition is amazing, but the PSP is quicker and simpler to play, and that may be someone's preference. It's weird how both versions highlight each other's weaknesses, but if there's one area that curb stomps the other, it's story sequences. Now the PSP isn't a slouch at all. It has beautiful visuals, great font that is very readable, and it's inside text boxes you can change the colour of. It all works to convey the story. The problem is it's competing with the DS. Get over how low poly these models are, and how it's immediately less beautiful than the pixel art brethren it has, and you are left with cutscenes that have very nice staging, multiple angles to emphasize whatever is in focus, and scenes being represented more faithfully with actual effects to convey what used to be left up to our imagination. When the walls close in, you actually see it instead of just being told that's what's happening. This is further raised with the voice acting, which is used sparingly, but whenever it is used, it's all excellent. Well, except for Cecil being Yuri Lowenthal, but after his Dark Knight period, the voice actually does kind of suit him. Between these moments of voice actors trying to make me care about this melodramatic story, we have the usual RPG towns, fields, and dungeons. They're all done quite well, and I love the mix of sci-fi and fantasy that these early games did. But who cares about walking in these fields? We have multiple vehicles to worry about, and they're all replaced and upgraded at the exact moment we get bored of the old. And they managed to accomplish this trope without ever giving us a boat. Instead, we get a hovercraft that only works on land, and a spaceship, and everything in between except a boat. This does include multiple airships because this is a 16-bit RPG after all. Both versions let us switch our overworld sprites to another character in our party, and on DS, every time we open our menu, a thought bubble appears. Each character has different ones, and these update very frequently based on whatever just happened in the plot or an important discovery we made. Though some of these do love shining a spotlight on what will be the main plot point in 10 minutes or so it can kill the surprises. If Cecil were about to die, he would be thinking about how much he loves life but how he has a sinister feeling about now. He's that kind of guy, but his friends aren't much better either. With that said, this is a really cute feature and it had me checking my menu and rotating my lead much more often than I would have otherwise. It's like an anti-social party chat. Each dungeon manages to look unique with their own strong atmospheres, and these translate well into the battle screens themselves. Though the 3D version does use obvious backdrops in battles, though from a lot of angles the illusion is very passable, and when it isn't it's just kind of funny. Inside dungeons we usually can't save the game, though there are specific areas where you can save and recover the character's health and magic with the use of a single-use item like a tent. But these being portable games, the option to save anywhere would be nice, so they actually did provide a solution of sorts. Here on DS you can perform a temporary quick save. However, these are the kind of temporary saves that kick you out of the game, and when you reload it your quick save is erased. This way you can stop anywhere, but you can't abuse the ability to save. Thankfully, proper save rooms are right where you need them, like midpoints in dungeons or right before a boss. Regular proper saving can be done anywhere else on the overworld. The quick saving thing is just a way to not be inconvenient to players without sacrificing the original intent. The PSP version did omit this due to that system having a sleep mode, but it was a feature in its predecessor for Game Boy Advance. Previously I made it seem like the PSP version was way more convenient since battles are quicker and your movement speed is increased, as well as other things I didn't allude to like how climbing ropes is a slow ordeal on DS but very fast on PSP. But in another change like how DS added infinite areas in the map at all times, this version comes out swinging with another convenient update thanks to years of hindsight. In a lot of old RPGs you'd have very limited storage and you need to keep things in an item bank since you couldn't carry infinite goods. The PSP kept this, and it's rarely an issue, but it can be at times like when you're changing inventory. Instead of a bank, we have a giant chocobo, and here's your storage locker. I love him. The DS on the other hand has infinite items, and I much prefer this system. And this didn't leave the chocobo unemployed. He's how we messed with White, and how we accessed the bestiary. There's even a cybernetic version of him in one area. This is a needless update and I love it. They thought of everything on the DS. I really did enjoy both versions of this game, and honestly much more than I ever expected, since the first 3 games weren't especially my jam. They were all alright, and my favourite of them was Final Fantasy II, due to its focus on story and characters. And Final Fantasy IV took that and ramped it up much more so. From my perspective, I had way more fun playing the at times frustrating DS release. Combat was more engaging, the story felt more impactful with voice acting in more angles, and any DS RPG that puts a map on the bottom screen gets high marks from me. That being said, it's definitely not for everyone. The difficulty is a legitimate roadblock, and I won't fault anyone who wants beautiful pixel art over these very dated models. The PSP has stunning visuals that still hold up, and both the original and rearranged soundtrack which can be toggled in the settings at any time. Plus it's more faithful to what the devs originally intended for in the 90s, for better and worse. This would make a fantastic introduction to the series, or even the genre for newcomers, and for old fans this PSP release is the complete edition after all, so there's a lot to sink your teeth into. The After Years is here too, and I originally planned on talking about it before I realised it was a full story that would occupy dozens of hours of my life. No thank you, I don't need more Final Fantasy IV right now, I've already done enough. That being said, it is a great value proposition, and something the DS version is weaker for not having. I am aware the Steam release of the 3D version also does include the after years, but on top of not wanting to play it now, I get kind of uneasy seeing these ugly models in high resolution. Sorry, but I need my ugly 3D to be as low quality as possible to better mask the deficiencies. But on Steam it does have an easier difficulty and more saving, so if you really want the 3D version and want it to be more welcoming, I guess that's your ideal version, even if I haven't touched it. The PSP version also does include the middle game, and it's exclusive to it, but it is very short, so it shouldn't be your reason for buying this game. Instead, your reason for buying this should be an unhealthy compulsion to hoard. If someone were to condense everything I said into a small marketable blurb that removes all the nuance, then it would just be, Final Fantasy IV on DS is the version I prefer, but Final Fantasy IV on PSP is the version I would recommend to more people. Regardless, you're in for a good time. I should know because this has been my entire life for weeks. Just know your limits and pick the appropriate version. If I were wise, I'd not play two different versions of a game again, but instead, next video I'll be looking at Sonic Advance and its N-Gage version Sonic N. Hopefully it'll be the least controversial Sonic video on the internet, because I still kind of like these games, and I won't even mention how much I dislike Sonic Adventure 2 or Heroes, and how Sonic Colors on the Wii was my favourite console entry since the Mega Drive. Nope, I won't mention those at all.